Well, good morning, everybody. I'm going to do something just a little bit different today. Instead of kind of putting all the long-range content at the end, I want to start off with it for you today because I want to do a summary of all of our winter forecasts and I think what it might mean. I think so much of our winter forecast is based upon this map, and this is very typical of this time of year. When we look out there at the seasonal projections, they're very, very sensitive to the current ocean temperature state and how it's been changing. The other thing they're sensitive to is soil moisture. So I want to think this through as we start to just play out a longer range forecast because we do have a developing La Nina, although it's relatively weak at this point. But I think the bigger factors, which I have not been able to fully analyze in an analog sense, I'm working on that right now, is the evolution of this very warm water here. Now, if we slide into a typical fall and winter, I expect this to fade or maybe even shift a bit to the east. But it'll be the development of cooler water out ahead of it. Should that happen, that could really be a major influence on the pattern. So there are North Pacific and Central Pacific issues that we have to think about. Now, you may ask, why not more in the Atlantic? Right now, I'm looking at the upstream pattern. In the Atlantic, the majority of it is warm, right? And I'm going to be waiting later on in fall to see if we can get a shift in the pressure patterns that are associated with the Arctic Oscillation and the North Atlantic Oscillation. And those two things, though, are very much, they're not even, I wouldn't even call them sub-seasonal. They're very short-term things. So I look at the whole Atlantic, seeing it so warm, and I'm looking for where there could be something that has contrast to affect the longer range. So that's why I'm focusing a lot on the Pacific Ocean. Okay, all of that is to say this. Are the trade winds really cooking yet? Not really. I mean, there has been, over the last, 45 days or so, some decent burst of trade wind activity that have give us the indication of a La Nina. But honestly, if I were going to be making this for a call for a really strong La Nina, you need to see this color spread out over a larger area. And to be honest, we'd already want to be seeing a bit of a reversal in the trade winds over in the Indian Ocean, get them coming back a bit quicker in this direction. And we'd see the loss of momentum in the North Pacific if La Nina were coming on full force in early fall. But that's not common. It usually reaches a peak in December and January, and so we just need to be paying attention to it. We've seen a couple of our other variables make the turn. So for example, the Southern Oscillation Index, which really made a nice surge in late summer and early fall, then dropped off over the last month or so. It's come back up here above zero. So that means there is some trade wind activity on the La Nina side of average. But I want to think about this now in the context of a year ago. Because to be honest with you, the height pattern from a year ago, or excuse me, not the height pattern, but the wind pattern and the low levels of the atmosphere didn't look that different a year ago compared to this year. So what was going on a year ago? Well, if we come over here and look in November of 2023, we watched a big trade wind surge. That's why it didn't look too different. But then it really dropped off as we got into late winter. And we were dealing with the effects of an El Nino that was trying to transition out of being an El Nino back to neutral or even La Nina, which was what we saw kind of develop as we got into the spring and summer of this year. But a year ago, this is how things looked. All right, so notice the major differences in the North Pacific and, of course, along the equator here, where our ENSO region is, El Nino and La Nina. So this is this year, and this was a year ago at this time. And a year ago at this time, NOAA had put out its seasonal forecasts. It had said drier risks across the north and across the Great Lakes region, wetter California, wetter southeast and up the East Coast. And on the temperature side of it, where's that temperature forecast? There it is. Very warm across the northern tier of the U.S. compared to average, and near normal to cooler than normal down here across, the south. So we go, all right, did that pan out? Well, if we had to find where there was some drier conditions, I do see a few areas here during winter, very wet in the southeast, wet up the East Coast. At times we had those big snowstorms that came on in a couple of bursts. That was it. But most of this was rain because it was so mild last year. These were the November 30th to March 1st. So that's our winter, really December through February. Everywhere that you see the number 1 was the new record warmest December. And, this El Nino was a major promoter of that. And we can't really fault NOAA. I mean, that's what they called for. And I'll be honest, well done. I think this was pretty good of a forecast. And even on the precipitation side, just see this pattern here and where it was wetter. And we look back and say, yeah, okay. And you can see a couple of those areas. So you never please never take their forecasts and make them what they're not. These are just probability maps. So they're just looking for patterns, just like I do. All right. Continuing with that idea, this is what the ECMWF said a year ago. So they were a bit drier here, drier across the north, drier Great Lakes, drier back in Mid-South, wetter, wetter, wetter. So that lines up halfway decent. And even the IRI multi-model probability forecast, which kind of blends in the NMME, it's a part of it, they saw it too. So we looked back at last year, and we'd have to say that some of these forecasting groups did a good job at finding these overall patterns. My biggest misstep last year was that I thought the front half of the winter was going to be very warm. We knew this. I felt confident, but I really thought we were going to get more than just 1 week of cold weather on the back half of winter. So big misstep on my part for the temperature pattern last year. Okay, so where does that leave us now? Well, this is what we've been discussing. We do have a La Nina, so it's different. And you'll notice that when you look historically, we flipped the pattern over a year ago. We tend to have better chances of colder air outbreaks across the northern tier of the U.S., more mild south. So that is a complete opposite of a year ago. And where did we have the dryness a year ago? It was here and it was there, right? And now you notice that we're having these drier risks south of that line. And so that's just what history would tell us, 1979 to present, when we have a La Nina forming, if you look at the November through March temperature and precipitation compared to their historical averages. Again, this is correlation. This is not, we're simply looking for patterns. But then we made the case that, is this La Nina actually strong? And I showed you earlier in the month the new ECMWF forecast, which really backed off on the strength of this La Nina. We've made a case this week that if it is in fact a weaker La Nina, we can look at some historical data to try to figure out maybe what each month is going to look like, right? So this was the November outlook, which suggested that maybe throughout the Mid-South and over toward the Mid-Atlantic and the Southeast could be a little drier, but possibly a pretty rapid onset in the month of November to the wetter conditions, mainly focused on the Pacific Northwest, including Northern California. And we'll keep an eye on the upper Midwest and Northeast for possibly wetter conditions in November. We said, what about December? Well, December tended to drop deeper troughs into the west. This was a bit of a curious signal here, being drier in and around this part of coastal Washington, given that the rest of the west has a wetter signal. But if it's drier, it was a couple of just places here. And overall, we packed in kind of an early inactive winter. And then as we transitioned into January through March, the pattern tended to go drier from the west coast of the United States, kind of down through the southwest and into Texas, whereas the pattern really began to pick up here in the Mississippi, mid-Mississippi, and Ohio Valley, even getting down here into this part of the Mid-South. We still tended to stay drier in a couple of areas. This would suggest that the jet comes in and out, very highly amplified. I didn't show this yesterday, I should have, but I wanted to also show you that those same winters, when you look at the temperature contrast, so December to February now, we tend to be much cooler than average, much colder than average across the northern tier of the United States, and mild more across the south and east, maybe up the east coast. Now, that's it. That's what these correlations with weak La Ninas show. So thinking all of that through, let's now go back to models. And we know that the European model, which is always released first, gave us this November to January precipitation outlook. That's over there on the left. And I wrote over it. After October, November, December have been trending wetter. And you can see that in this forecast. Much wetter in the Northwest, wetter across the northern tier of the U.S., wetter here in the Ohio Valley. And I've been showing in every video that the lack of moisture, the soil moisture issues we're dealing with in this part of the country. And so this is not just needed, this is desperately needed in order to prevent major drought risk in 2025. Once we get into, January through March, I'm expecting a highly variable Pacific jet and a weaker subtropical jet. So you end up getting the precipitation patterns in the background here. If I show you the NMME, the National Multi-Model Ensemble, this is November through January, January through March. It's kind of a copy of that. It's a little bit drier in the Central Plains than the European is, but this is just probabilities. So it's just saying, hey, maybe better chance of being on the drier side than the wetter. But you can't argue that the pattern is much different. The CFSV2 saw something similar. In fact, let's go to the precip first. This is the January, February, March outlook. And again, I see a lot of similarities in all of our modeling systems. And what does it do? It splits. It kind of splits the country in winter, much colder north and warmer south, which is, again, the opposite of what we saw a year ago. And I'm looking right down here at this figure. So that brings me all the way to this. And yesterday, just after I finished recording, the National Weather Service did update their seasonal forecast. So again, I was impressed with what they came up with last year, so let's go and have a look at it this year. If you come to the CPC website and slide down here, click on the words 3-month, and it'll actually take you to their model output. Now, let's just walk through this quickly here. November, December, January. This is their forecast. Drier across the south, wetter northwest, starting to see an increase in precip probabilities here around the Great Lakes. If we go from there to December, January, February, drier south, weaker subtropical jet, wetter northwest, wetter Great Lakes. January, February, March, very active Ohio Valley storm track. The question I have is, what do the Atlantic Ocean temperatures do? What does the Arctic Oscillation do? The North Atlantic Oscillation possibly do to plant big areas of high pressure here? Because that will determine if we get storm systems that will come in and go out, or do they push over and go up, or do they hook from the panhandles down and run, because it's been a while since the Northeast has seen a really good, strong winter, and it'll be questionable if that can happen this year. It'll all boil down to that North Atlantic pattern, which we'll have to watch develop week by week once we get into winter. But let's just keep going. January, February, March, April. I'm still seeing some similar things here. This would be next spring, March, April, May. They're watching this linger wet. Okay, and then you get out here to April, May, June. And then May, June, July, we're just looking at their model output. And what they're suggesting here for next summer, June, July, August, is that if there's drought building and it's coming out of the Canadian prairie into, Montana, the northern plains. Now, we looked yesterday, if you remember, go back to yesterday, and said that summer, following years with La Nina winters that were weak, this whole corridor tended to be dry. And I'm worried about that, given that we have such low soil moisture. So again, just to pull this up, this is the website, and it's just NASA's website where they're putting their soil moisture data. And if we just come over here and select the latest percentile maps for 40 centimeters or 16 inches, I think this is a bigger part of our story for drought risk next year. Now, honestly, we need every bit of this February, March, April pattern to verify if you're in these areas that are dry. This is not good for the southern plains, so if it does verify, that's going to be a continuation of drought. It's going to be something we'll be very concerned about. We're already concerned about it now, but going into next year. So I want to do one last thing. I want to look at the temperature probability of occurrence. So this is now what the winter could look like in terms of the temperature pattern. And again, they've gone pretty aggressive on keeping this risk of cold air intruding into this area. And it fits. It fits with the historical climatology data. So if we look at that, where did I put that thing? Was it here? That's what happened in those weak La Nina years. So until I have evidence to overturn any of this, this is what my winter forecast is going to look like. What is not represented, and this is absolutely huge, is the week-to-week variability because of subseasonal factors. You go, what are those? Well, changes in the MJO, changes in the West Pacific Oscillation or the Pacific North American pattern, or changes in the North Atlantic. All of that is what gives us the highly variable week-to-week, behavior in the atmosphere. But if you ask us what's going on seasonally, you've now seen my latest thoughts. My biggest concern, again, is what happens with this going forward over the next 6 months. And that is what I will focus on, because it's all about this next growing season and how we prepare for it. All right, now let's get into the near-term stuff. Satellite data. Sun's trying to rise on the East Coast, deep low just off the coast. That was been a pretty one to watch here on satellite. But yesterday we're watching the deep low move into the Colorado. Remember that Colorado low we've been talking about? But as I watched towards sunset, I saw some interesting things happening in a few different areas around the country. For example, in the southeast, we must have had numerous prescribed burns. Can you actually see in Georgia, getting over into parts of Alabama, Mississippi, the smoke trails here. And also here in the Delta, If you just take a look as I go back and forth, the lower Mississippi River Valley, numerous, I believe they're all controlled burns on these, on these very productive ground in this area. And then we were very worried about the high winds coming out of the south. And while there's a lot of cloud cover here on the western side of the plains, there were fires that were really kicking off some large smoke plumes, some in Kansas. Here's one in Nebraska, and there were some up farther north in South Dakota as well. So just wanted to point that out. Today, the discussion is going to translate into how quickly this low gets cut off. It's almost there. The main flow, as we talked about, is going to go over the top of it. And when it sits here, it's probably going to be there till Sunday. And once it ejects on Sunday, that's when things are going to change up. So in the meantime, a lot of freeze warnings, winter storm warnings. We have winter weather advisories. We had red flag warnings in California's northern part of its Central Valley. Strong winds down in the southwest. The colder air is exiting east, and the middle part of the country is just getting a break ahead of the changes that are going to be happening here. So that's this morning's all hazards weather map, just a hair before 6 a.m. If we watch where this is going on the high-res NAM, this is my map. I've shown you this one a while because we haven't had a lot of snow to talk about, but this is when I color code according to, rain, snow, and or ice. And as we play it forward, that low curls up over the Four Corners states. Some light showers are possible out ahead of it. The next system hits the northwest, but mainly going to be up in British Columbia. And we're just going to watch this thing sit and spin here. And that's what's going to give us this flooding threat in this area. Did you notice that? Watch me go back and forth here. That's backward in time. Here we go forward again through Saturday into Sunday now. It just sits and spins, and it won't be until we get out there until Sunday night that it finally starts to eject into the plains. This big high pressure cell, plus the fact that it's just cut off from the upper level flow, which is way up here, is what's keeping this thing relatively stationary. So where's it going to go? Well, I like to show you all these models. They're all on agweather.com, so you can go look at them there. But, when we think about where it's going, they all kind of have a similar feel to them. And if we just take a look here, let's open the WPC forecast. That's what it's got for the next 7 days. Now, there is the chance that after producing all this heavy rain in here, we could get some stronger storms late this weekend and early next week that stay to the south of this low when it does finally leave. The northwest continues to take some stronger flow from the Pacific Ocean. Some people are already calling this an atmospheric river. We've got to be careful. Terminology, we don't tend to see really strong flow across the Pacific until you get into the cold season. But certainly there is some heavy precip coming into this kind of Puget Sound area. Okay. But outside of that, much of the rest of the country is on the drier side of average. So let's go ahead and play out for you the European model. Again, some stronger winds still lingering here, but they start to back off today. So we see the high pressure settling in here. We see the chances for precip late tonight moving out into parts of the plains, stretching all the way up here toward this part of Ontario, Minnesota, Lake Superior. There's the next push of moisture coming into that section of the west coast of North America. And we just wait. Yep, this pushes in, but the low just sits there and spins. And then finally, here it is. That's Sunday night, Monday morning through Tuesday. That's it. I'm keeping an eye right here. Just kind of ejects. I'll talk to you about the chances for storms early next week as well. And we could see some moisture getting in across this, this region here early next week. Southern Canada, parts of Montana, North Dakota, Minnesota. All right. After that, there's a chance the models have increased through the Great Lakes into the Northeast by next Thursday. Moisture. It's not a lot, but there's something sweeping through there. And we play it out a bit farther. We kind of get ourselves into this waiting pattern. We're going to wait till the end of the month to see what can change in the Northwest to begin to drive systems back into the rest of the United States. So there is some snow in this. Let's go and have a look at it here. Just play it forward to see how much we're expecting here. I think there's going to be some really high snowfall totals that are going to be getting into parts of the Colorado Rockies here based upon where that low is going to sit and spin. But other than that, it's going to really, I think, open the ski season here for this part of Canada between British Columbia and Alberta, just given the way that the upper level flow is targeting this region, just running that flow over the mountains. In terms of how much snow, this is a probability map of getting 3 inches. Let's go ahead and step it up to a foot just to kind of get a better sense here. And we got just a couple areas here that could get up over a foot of snow Watch this region carefully. On the precipitation side, total precipitation side, let's look to see who's going to be dry. This is 10 days probability of staying under a ½ inch. And it's pretty clear that we've got several large kind of epicenters, of drier conditions here and here. And then so much of this region, even more the upper Midwest now, still showing up with not much precip. So even the system I showed you coming through, that frontal boundary, late next week, it's not doing much in terms of making precip. The wettest conditions are leaving this upper level low that's kind of jumping out here in Colorado. Okay, so how about figuring out what follows it? Yesterday we saw the big Halloween storm. Is it still in the AI? Well, here we go. This is out there next Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. Now as we get into Friday, October 25th, we got some flow doing this, which is interesting. This will be a big warm-up here, but there's some cooler air coming into the West Coast to finish this month. And the AI model at the end of the month, instead of now dropping a huge trough over the Great Lakes, has got it just opening up somewhere in this vicinity on the 29th, and then a reinforcing shot around Halloween. But so the difference is yesterday on Halloween, this was here. What it looks like to me, though, is that the pattern's just getting a bit more amplitude to it. And that's what helps us think about the way that, the month of November could be just not a drought-inducing type pattern. So we'll keep watching that. Okay, but I do want to show you the day 8 through 14, which gets us out to the end of the month. This is our last week of the month, so we can see all across the maps. Do take note that we're wetter here, and there's a signal there. Okay, AI is really strong with it. Wetter, there's some sort of wetter signal in the midsection of the country. Driest area, I think, is going to be somewhere between the southwest and then down into the southeast up the East Coast. Okay. Quick on the tropics, we have a 10% chance now of that first system, which we watch really fade. They've upped this to 50%, but most models take whatever that thing is and shove it into this part of Central America, then into Mexico. So this is no threat to the United States in the near term. Okay, so as we start to look longer term, I think one of the big changes we'll get for the month of November is the MJO is moving. And it's out right now in phase 4 or 5, and it's going to sweep around to phase 5, 6, and 7. So speaking of the tropics, there is something we need to discuss here, and that is this kind of wave. If it does, by the end of October, start to bring in better rising motion back over the Caribbean and the Gulf, that could mean another surge of tropical activity late in October, and certainly the ocean temperatures are warm enough for that. Speaking of temperatures, here's our latest update of a map on frost. So this is our frost threat over the next 7 days. A lot of this is cooler air this morning here, but then there's another push of colder air coming across the north. Nothing surprising here. This is just from the upper level low. And our high temperatures look something like this. So here's today's highs, getting into tomorrow on Saturday, Sunday. Wow, Sunday. I mean, we might crack 80 in Minnesota and Wisconsin. This is Monday, Tuesday of next week. There's our next little push of colder next Wednesday and Thursday. But still quite mild. So to summarize, your next 5 days are here. This is day 5 through 10. And models after about day 10 continue to try to drop more cold air as we start the month of November, which would suggest a pattern that wants to put more troughs into the western United States and have them run up over a ridge that might live here for a while. Now, how long does that last, and does it shift east? Well, the European models suggest that it does shift east. And this is the newest update for the month of November. What's changed? We're still wetter across the west coast. This area has expanded. The dryness to the south has shrunk. So the models are seeing the MJO movement. They're seeing the La Nina. They're seeing the transitions we talked about at the beginning kind of playing out. And I can make some sense of this. But I got to be honest, I'm also looking for this, right? I look out there and I'm like, man, I want that wet. So I'm a hammer and all I can find is nails, and my nail is wetter conditions here. So I need to watch this carefully to make sure my own biases aren't creeping into this. Because if persistence wins the day, this is a blown forecast. Okay? All right, let's finish it up with South America. I just want to point out again, this is what satellite imagery looks like when the monsoon starts. All of this deep convection going here. And the newest forecasts continue to show wet across the north, but drier to the south. Maybe it's easier to see it this way. Wetter than average here, drier in southern Brazil, but this area's been wet. Buenos Aires a bit drier down here, this part of Buenos Aires, but Cordoba, Santa Fe, very wet in the near term. And if we look out there at the GFS, it's almost got the same forecast. Longer term, this is how things are shaping up through the month of November. This will be the most important feature to watch. If we build in drier conditions here, we'll likely see them reflect again down here, and this corridor will stay wet. And it might be that way through January and February. So I'll be watching that trend as well. Okay, that's it. You all have a great weekend, and I will pick this up again on Monday. Thanks.